IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm your host, Sri Krishna Upadhyaya, and the guest on the show today is Manoj Kewalramani, the China dude from Takshashila. Manoj, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hi, Shri. Thank you so much.
So, Manoj, you have come out with a working paper called The Israel-Hamas War, China's Interests and Crisis Diplomacy, where you offer your analysis of China's response to Israel-Hamas war following the events of October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched an attack against Israel, right? And you also look at China's crisis diplomacy and going by the diplomatic events between China, Israel, and rest of the world, which have taken place since then, you give an assessment of the interests and risks that are bearing on Beijing's mind while it continues to engage in this region. So before we look at your analysis, let's start this off in Takshashila style, right? Let's begin with the RBF or the reverse Bollywood format, where you tell us your conclusions upfront. So Manoj, what are your sort of key takeaways from the analysis that you have done?
Right. So when I looked at what China has been doing over the last now 2 months since the attack by Hamas, the objective was to try and, because a lot of the focus has been that, this is a war in which the United States and the West is on one side, and China is being neutral. And so I thought it would be good to just look at what exactly is it that China is trying to do, and is it actually neutral? So what I found out after observing Chinese policy since October 7th was this, that there is a clear decision in Beijing to lean in favor of the Palestinian side. Now, this statement in itself is slightly, uh, is slightly odd, because it's not necessarily that Beijing is supporting Palestine per se, but it's leaning on that side because it's leaning on the side of the Arab states. And this decision is a product of a mix of economic and strategic calculations, which we'll get into. But primarily, what Beijing seems to be prioritizing is its strategic competition with the US, and how its decisions in this particular conflict will impact strategic competition with the US. So in that context, it seems to be viewing Israel as an extension of American power in the region, and therefore, in leaning towards the Arab states, if it is leading to a damaged relationship with Israel in the future, Beijing is seemingly okay with that. So that's the first point that seems to come across in terms of how China has behaved since October 7th. The second thing is that, at any level, instability in this region and broader conflict in this region is not something that is in China's interest, right? And we'll talk about its interest in terms of energy trade in particular. It's a energy hungry nation. Its energy needs are still growing, and a lot of that is coming from this part of the world, from the Middle East or West Asia. So instability, conflict, violence, which expands beyond where it has been currently, is not in China's interest. At the same time, if this is an environment in which the US is deeply involved and further distracted, particularly given the fact that the US has already been distracted and is deeply engaged in the war in Ukraine, it potentially gives some breathing room to Beijing, because there is only, at the end of the day, so much diplomatic and security capacity that any state, even the US, has, right? So it gives some additional leverage points. That said, of course, an expansion of the conflict is not in China's interest. So what has Beijing been doing in this context, and why do I arrive at this conclusion, is basically because when you look at how China has engaged diplomatically, it has done very little. It has talked a very big game, but it has actually done very little. It has sent essentially no senior official. The foreign minister of China has not visited the region. The head of the Communist Party's international liaison department has not really engaged. In fact, he's currently just visited Iran, of all the countries in the region. So there has been very little serious engagement by Beijing at the highest levels. What they have done is they have a special envoy to the Middle East, who has traveled. His name is Jaijun. He has traveled and he has not visited Israel. He's visited the Arab states and he's basically sort of gathered consensus with them and worked with them. Now you can contrast this with American diplomacy, where you had Blinken, where you had the CIA director, and where you have even Joe Biden visiting. And Biden wanted to visit both Israel and the West Bank. And at the last minute, the West Bank visit did not happen owing to the Palestinians saying no. So the US is far more deeply engaged. Another example is, you look at China's overall humanitarian aid. It has sent 8 trucks of humanitarian supplies recently to Gaza, but its commitment in terms of financial commitment was around, if I'm correct, 2 million US dollars in immediate assistance and 15 million in worth of 15 million RMB in worth of supplies. Which 15 million RMB is again less than about around 2 million US dollars again. So in comparison, the Americans have committed 100 million US dollars in terms of support for the Palestinians. So there is a big gap in terms of what China is saying and what it's actually doing. And finally, what does all this broadly tell us about China's engagement in the region, right? And its seriousness with regard to the Palestinian cause. It tells you that it's not necessarily terribly serious about actually arriving at a solution of the Palestinian issue, or in terms of commitment of resources and capabilities, or perhaps it does not necessarily have the capability and to actually shape outcomes in the region, right? And that can send a message to Arab states, to Israel, to many others, that while Beijing is talking a big game and while it is staying back to try and see what happens and then intervene, it might not necessarily be as credible a security actor in the region that it claims to be, or that at least that Iran-Saudi peace agreement that Beijing ushered in by entering into the deal at the last minute made us believe, right? So that's the broad conclusion of what I thought of how China has behaved since October 7th.
Right. So we'll dig into each of these aspects that you mentioned, but let's begin with China's crisis diplomacy over the last few months, right? And I think one major event which happened was China attaining the presidency of the UN Security Council somewhere in early November. I mean, you've already pointed this out that China's diplomacy has been very high on rhetoric and low on substance. But did you think there was a change once the UNSC presidency was taken over by China? Did its efforts and its attempts at building a consensus see any change? So what has that terrain been like?
So this was really interesting, right? And again, really, sometimes when you are in a seat of power, it can come at a very difficult time, unfortunately, and then you have to sort of make the best of it. I think in China's case, they have done that, right? They have, and if you again done that in the context of keeping these broad interests that I talked about, that competition with the US at the forefront, and then in that context, what has China done? If you look, you can see that they've actually achieved probably what they could have in terms of their actually probably the most that they could have in terms of the situation and in terms of the presidency month that they enjoyed. So if you go back to October 7th, right, soon after the attack that took place in Israel, you didn't hear Beijing condemning the attack. Right. It simply said that, we were, everybody must exercise restraint. Then it expressed concern. It called for calm and to end the hostilities and protect the civilians and avoid a further deterioration of the situation. At the same time, while Beijing made that statement on October 8th, you had a American congressional delegation visiting China, the first in a very, very long time, which signaled obviously a new thaw in US-China relations. And that delegation quite publicly said that, look, we raised this issue with the Chinese, that we are quite disappointed by your lack of much more forceful condemnation of what Hamas has done. And then what you got from the Chinese foreign ministry in response was they said that, look, they didn't mention Hamas by name. They didn't talk about terrorism. They basically said that, look, we acknowledge that there have been casualties and we are saddened by the loss of life. So that's as far as they went in terms of condemnation of Hamas, right? Now compare that to, say, Indian responses. India's response was very strong on terrorism. So it gave you a very early hint of in which way China was leaning. Since then, in the paper, what I document is, how Beijing has engaged with every party. and predominantly with Arab states. It's talked to the Europeans, it talked to the Americans, and essentially its argument has been that, look, we will try and work with all of you, but we think that this is, we won't necessarily condemn Hamas, we won't name them also. It made no real statement about Israeli hostages in Hamas's captivity, but it did criticize Israel's bombing response. Right? It did make comments about how this has gone beyond self-defense, and actions must be consistent with humanitarian law. It talked about how Israel must stop quote unquote collective punishment of Gazans. So it did use all the language that it felt strong enough to criticize Israel. But there was no condemnation of what Hamas had done, firstly. At the same time, like I said, it worked with Arab states and it worked with developing countries to try and build some sort of a consensus around the issue that, look, this conflict is not in anybody's interest. It is going to hurt everybody. And the reason why this conflict has broken out again is because the fundamental issue of the statehood of Palestine has not been addressed. And until and unless you address that fundamental issue, this region is not going to enjoy peace and stability, and therefore everybody needs to address that issue. And China's proposal was that we call for a new peace conference, which draws up a clear blueprint or a roadmap for achieving a two-state solution. And this is parts of sort of long-standing Chinese policy. So this is not new invention. So there is a lot of continuity in what Beijing had said in the past. But the difference here is that there was no condemnation of Hamas's action, the proximate cause. While one may agree with the broader point that Beijing is making, that yes, you need to have a two-state solution, you need to recognize the rights of the Palestinian people and all of that. It is noteworthy that there was no criticism of the proximate cause. In the entire 2 months, there have been only two direct conversations between, at least publicly that we know of, between the Chinese officials and Israeli and Palestinian officials. So there was one conversation with the Palestinian foreign minister, and there was one conversation with the Israeli foreign minister. If you go through the readouts, which I cover in the paper, what you will see is that there is significant criticism of Israeli actions with little understanding. It's not that there is no understanding, but there is largely calling for restraint, and it's understandable why that is the case. But with the Palestinians, there's much more solidarity without, again, any criticism of what Hamas has done. So that was the scenario in which China took over the presidency of the UN Security Council on November 1st. When it took over the presidency, it said that, look, this issue of Israel-Palestine is the most urgent issue that is going to be on the table for us, and we will do our best to try and address it. And before that, there were a couple of attempts to try and get a UN Security Council resolution on the issue. But none of those passed, right? There was one resolution that was proposed, which the Americans vetoed. There was another which the Russians and the Chinese themselves didn't agree to. So the UN Security Council was basically not getting anywhere. So in this situation, from a Chinese point of view, the idea was, how can you sort of get some outcome at the UN, right? The UNGA, on the other hand, General Assembly, had passed a resolution which sort of leaned towards, this conflict needs to stop. Israel needs to stop its bombing campaign, and you can see based on that resolution how the US and Israel were among the people who did not agree with that resolution. So you can see which way that resolution was largely leaning, and which way the dominant international community's narrative was largely leaning. So in this context, when the Chinese sort of took over the UN Security Council, they tried to get as many people together, and they tried to sort of make sure that you can get a resolution going. Their early efforts ended in frustration because the different sides were essentially not. It was very difficult to find the right kind of language to get different sides together. But and on November 10th, there was a emergency meeting on this issue. And in that, the Chinese ambassador, Zhang Jun, there's a exclamation from him where he starts going off about, how enough is enough, and, the Security Council must stop this obstruction. There's a lot of criticism of the US in this as major powers that are trying to, fuel fire and not necessarily getting on with the job of actually trying to achieve a ceasefire. Now, this is very nicely playing to as much as the frustration is genuine, there is also playing to the gallery. Because the US, if you noted, also wanted Israel to pull back in terms of the ferocity of its attacks in Gaza, because whether it was the bombing of a refugee camp, whether it was that controversy around that hospital, which reportedly was a product of Israeli bombing, but then subsequently there was much more to it than reported Israeli bombing. So there was lots of fog of war, but there was lots of narrative building and criticism. And I think the Americans also realized that, look, this bombing campaign will not necessarily get you to where it has. And I think Biden administration officials made that point to their Israeli counterparts in more ways than one. And if you go back to American diplomacy, there was this phrase of, our approach must be hug Bibi while trying to tell him that, you need to scale back on some of this stuff. So it was in America's interest also to try and get a resolution which calls for, if not a ceasefire, because the US was not using the word ceasefire, and lots of Western countries were not using the word ceasefire, but at least some sort of a pause in hostilities, right? So the Chinese used that opportunity, and they worked with the Americans and they worked with the others to eventually get a resolution passed. And the resolution passed by 12-0 votes. The US and UK abstained, and the Russians abstained. The resolution did not call for a ceasefire, which is why Russia abstained. And it said that, look, the UNGA resolution wanted a ceasefire. The Americans abstained for other reasons. But the resolution essentially was a compromise, right? And the Chinese ambassador basically said that, look, this is the minimum consensus that we have achieved at the UN Security Council. And it demonstrates that we are for peace. And it demonstrates that we can get things done, right? And this was a significant achievement for Beijing, right? Because it showed that it could be pragmatic in dealing with international issues, because the resolution also talked about the need for captives to be sent back. So it sort of acknowledged that Hamas's attack had led to captives. It also showed that Beijing could pressurize the US and could work with the US when it suits American interests. So it sends a message to America that, look, we are willing partners with you when it comes to shared concerns at the international level. At the same time, Biden and Xi Jinping were meeting in San Francisco. So this is a positive message from Beijing being sent to the US. It's sending a message to the world that, look, China can work with Russia and it can achieve Russian acquiescence if it suits Chinese interests. And it sends a message to the developing world in the global south that China is your voice. It is at the UN Security Council. It is the country which was able to achieve this compromise more than anything else. So it was able to achieve all these outcomes without actually expending too much energy. In comparison, if you look at the United States, it is deeply engaged in the situation. Yet, and it is the country which has essentially brokered the humanitarian truce that lasted for a few days and which led to a prisoner swap and led to a pause in hostilities, but it got very little to no credit for that. So to me, that's what this last month in November at the UN Security Council tells us about Chinese diplomacy.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break. Right. That's fascinating. Thanks for taking us through the diplomacy that Beijing has engaged over the last couple of months in such detail. But in your paper, you point out that this Chinese pragmatism is actually driven by its regional interests, primarily economic and strategic interests, right? And you write that, and I quote, such statements and engagement are as much a reflection of Beijing's expanded economic and security interests as they are of the region's significance for China in the context of its strategic competition with the US, end quote. And in fact, you make a claim that all of this is China's efforts towards shaping a new international order as it wants. So why do you say that, Manoj?
Right. So I think that there is, if you look at China's interest, and in the paper I have this map in which everything is deeply interconnected. If you look at China's interest in the region, what you will see is that, it has predominantly looked at the region from an economic lens, and it is predominantly an economic actor in the region. Right? China's trade with Israel is around 20 to 22 billion dollars. It was much lower a couple of years ago. In the last 2-3 years, it has spiked up to that number. And a lot of it is Chinese exports. But Israel is much more important to China in terms of access to key technologies and investments in technologies and things like that. In comparison, China's trade with the Arab world as a whole is over $400 billion. And a lot of that trade is strategically important because it is energy trade predominantly, and energy trade is critical for China's own development. So when you compare, if you just don't look at the numbers, and if you also just look at the kinds of commodities that is trading with both of these entities, you will realize that trade with Arab world is much more important for China's broader interests. At the same time, if you look at China, how China looks at this region strategically, this is the center of geopolitical competition with the US. And Beijing looks at it and thinks that, look, if I want to be competing with the United States, who are my ideational partners? Who are the entities with whom I share certain traits in terms of governance ideologies? And I think that it finds itself in it finds much more common with the Arab, much more in common with the Arab world than it does with Israel. Like I said, it sees Israel as essentially an extension of American power. That doesn't mean that it can't engage with the country and it can't have so-called pragmatic cooperation. Um, but it does mean that there will be limits to that cooperation, whether that is uh, the Americans leaning in on Israel with regard to certain port deals with China and resulting in a pullback, or whether it is the Americans leaning in on Israel on certain technology deals with China and Israel then pulling back on some of that. So it feels that that kind of pressure is much more viable with Israel than with the Arab world. Also, I think when it looks at countries in the Arab world, whether it is Saudi Arabia, whether it is the UAE, and Iran obviously is part of the region, it sees these countries and says, look, they are looking to hedge because of the uncertainty of American expressions of power and American domestic politics and its implications on the Middle East. So, therefore, Middle Eastern countries are looking to hedge a little bit with the US. And in that, it opens up greater space for cooperation with China. And China is a big investor also in the Arab world. It's building tremendous infrastructure projects across the Arab world. So it feels that there is much more at stake in worsening ties with the Arab world. Additionally, um, when it comes to issues of, say, internal security in Xinjiang, I think that there are linkages in terms of the support that China seeks from Arab countries on the issue of Xinjiang. It allows it to fend off criticism from the United States and the West on human rights issues because it goes around flaunting the fact that, look, so many Muslim countries, the so-called Islamic countries, are supporting China's policies, and they see China's policies as being not violative of religious freedom. And the West, and particularly the United States, where there is Islamophobia, who are you to tell us what's happening? So there is a linkage to domestic security at a narrative level, but also at a practical level of security in terms of dealing with issues of terrorism, extremism, and religious fanaticism, right? So I think that it's this mix which makes Beijing lean much more heavily. And of course, a larger group of countries with a significant say in world affairs leaning in on Chinese viewpoints and backing Chinese viewpoints at international forums such as the United Nations or the WTO is something that Beijing requires, or it believes that it requires when it comes to pushing back against American dominance. So I think that's the interest matrix with which Beijing has approached the region, and it continues to approach the region. But like I said, I think to me the biggest takeaway from this entire situation is that while Beijing might be saying a lot of things and doing a little bit, its inability to actually take any tangible steps in regard to this conflict will actually send a message to these Arab leaders about the capability that China can bring to the region when it comes to security issues. Soon after the Israeli bombing campaign started, the US moved two aircraft carriers as a show of support to Israel. Um, China does not have that capacity. So if I am the leader of Saudi Arabia or any of the other countries, and I'm thinking of security deals and security guarantees in terms of who is the big dog in the region, um, China doesn't necessarily look like a safe bet because it has very limited capabilities. So to me, I think one of the outcomes, a peripheral outcome of the last 2 months of what is clearly a very horrible situation and an unfortunate situation, is the fact that China's lack of power and the gap between its narrative of being a great power and actual capabilities has come sharply to the fore, and I think this is a lesson that everybody will look at.
So thanks, Manoj, for joining us on this episode of All Things Policy and taking us through your latest working papers. To all our listeners, we are plugging the working paper to the show notes, so please do take a look and do let us know what you think of Manoj's analysis of China's diplomacy as regards the Israel-Hamas war. Thanks once again, Manoj, for joining.
Thank you so much, Sri. Take care.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.